The strange thing about Ready or Not, Here I Come is that it does not feel like a sequel trying to politely continue a story. It feels like a door kicked open in the middle of a disaster, with the camera already running and the characters already in danger. That is exactly why the film is such an intriguing return for this universe, because it does not ask whether Grace survived the first nightmare. It asks what happens when survival itself becomes the reason the nightmare grows larger. The first film turned Samara Uiving's Grace into one of modern horror's most memorable final girls, a character who fought her way out of a rich family's death ritual with equal parts panic and fury. The sequel pushes her into a new level of that same world, and the hook is simple but brutal. One deadly game was never the whole game. Once that idea lands, the whole movie changes shape in your mind. The story is no longer about escaping one cursed house, but about discovering how deep the system of power really goes. What makes this setup so effective is that the sequel does not waste time pretending Grace can return to normal life. According to the film's premise, she and her estranged sister Faith are now forced to outrun rival families competing for the high seat, a position that controls the world. That single detail expands everything. The danger is no longer local, private, or even merely personal. It becomes political, almost royal in its structure, and that shift gives the film a much bigger arena without losing the nasty, intimate pressure that made the original work. And then there is the emotional twist, because Faith is not just another companion in a horror sequel. Kэtrin Nьютon's character is Grace's estranged sister, which means the film is built on family damage that existed long before the killing starts. That is smart storytelling, because it gives the sequel two kinds of tension at once. One is physical survival, and the other is the far more painful problem of two people who know each other too well and still cannot fully trust one another. What do you do when the person beside you is both your only ally and a reminder of everything that went wrong? The opening idea of this sequel also works because it preserves the wicked fun of the original while scaling it up. The first film was a savage, tightly controlled hunt inside one family's home. The new film takes that same survival energy and drops it into a wider world of elite families, contracts, rituals, and a power structure that feels both absurd and terrifying. That move matters. A sequel like this can easily become bigger without becoming better, but here the larger mythology seems designed to intensify the panic instead of replacing it. The prize is bigger, the threat is wider, and the rules are uglier. This is also why the title matters more than it first seems. Here I Come sounds playful, almost childish, like a taunt from a game of hide and seek. But in this franchise, that phrase becomes a threat, because the game is no longer a joke among wealthy lunatics. It is the mechanism by which people are controlled, hunted, and sorted into winners and sacrifices. That tension between a familiar playground phrase and a deadly social order is exactly the kind of irony this series uses so well. It keeps the film from sliding into seriousness while still making the stakes feel real. The directors, Matt Bettinelli-Olpin and Tyler Gillett, return with the same horror comedy instincts that made the first film stand out, and their presence matters as much as any cast announcement. They know how to move between dread and joke without breaking the spell. They also know how to let a scene breathe just long enough for the audience to laugh before the next violent turn arrives. That balance is hard to maintain, and it is one reason the sequel was worth making in the first place. Without that tonal control, the whole concept could collapse into noise. The cast expansion also tells you a lot about the sequel's ambition. Sara Mishel Gellar, Elijah Wood, David Cronenberg, Kevin Durant, Nestor Carbonell, Olivia Cheng, and Sean Hennessy are all part of the new ensemble around Grace and Faith. That is not just a bigger cast, it is a signal that the story has moved beyond one family's madness into a larger network of people who are invested in the system staying alive. In a film like this, every new face can either be a clue, a threat, or a trap. Sometimes all three at once. The most interesting thing, though, is that the sequel seems to keep the first film's immediate aftermath alive, instead of pretending time has softened it. Sources describe the story as taking place right after the events of the original film, with Grace discovering that the nightmare is not over at all. That choice gives the movie urgency. It also makes Grace feel less like a returning icon and more like a woman who never got the chance to recover. That matters because horror sequels often weaken their lead by turning survival into a clean victory. This film appears to understand that surviving something terrible can leave you more exposed, not less. There is a very specific kind of thrill in that idea. It means the sequel is not just about monsters or villains. It is about systems that keep going after the blood has dried. That is where the high seat becomes such a strong narrative object. It sounds ceremonial, but it functions like a throne, a prize, and a machine for keeping power concentrated in the hands of a few. In one image, the movie turns private terror into social structure. That is the sort of concept horror fans love, because it gives every chase and every betrayal a bigger meaning. At the same time, the story has a built-in human core that keeps it from becoming too abstract. Grace and Faith were raised in foster care, and that background gives their relationship a history that is bruised, complicated, and believable. This means the sequel is not just asking whether they can survive the night. It is asking whether two damaged sisters can function as a team when the world has already taught them that family is fragile and conditional. That is a stronger emotional engine than simply bringing back a famous survivor for another round of bloodshed. The early critical response also suggests that the film understands what viewers are here for. Reviews from Essex Estavio described it as a savage, brisk sequel with breakneck pacing and a clear motive, even when some critics felt it leaned heavily on the original formula. That is useful context, because it tells you the movie is not trying to reinvent itself from scratch. It is trying to escalate. Sometimes escalation is exactly what a sequel should do, especially in a world where the first film already ended in chaos. The real question is not whether the movie is different. The real question is whether the movie finds a new level of insanity that feels earned, and that may be the most exciting part of the whole project. Ready or Not, Here I Come does not appear to be content with being a simple follow-up. It wants to widen the board, deepen the mythology, and keep Grace trapped inside a game that now feels older and more dangerous than anyone first realized. That kind of sequel can be risky, but it is also the kind most likely to stay in people's heads. Because once you reveal that one family's ritual was only the beginning, the audience starts asking the same question Grace does. How many other rooms are still hidden inside this house of horrors? What makes this opening so effective is that it leaves the viewer with a promise and a warning at the same time. The promise is more action, more gore, more dark comedy, and a bigger world of lunatic aristocrats. The warning is that Grace's story is no longer about escaping a single wedding from hell. It is about surviving an entire architecture of power that has decided she belongs inside it. That is a much nastier premise. And it is exactly the kind of premise that can carry a sequel far if the writing stays sharp. By the end of this first look, the film feels less like a return and more like an escalation of a curse that never really ended. Grace is back, Faith is now in the blast radius, and the high seat has turned survival into a competition with the world itself. That is a strong place to begin, because every great sequel needs one question that can pull the audience forward. Here, the question is simple and frightening. If the first game was only the beginning, what on earth does winning the next one cost? The sequel exists because the first film did something rare. It turned a sharp concept into a character-driven hit without losing its bite. That matters because a movie like this does not get a second life just from brand recognition. It gets one because the original left behind a world that still felt unfinished, and the audience could sense there was more horror hidden behind the rules. When a sequel is built on that kind of leftover pressure, it has a real chance to feel necessary instead of decorative. What makes the construction of these follow-ups especially interesting is how directly it continues the original story rather than rebooting it from a safe distance. Grace is not being reintroduced as a generic survivor who wandered away from the first movie and then got pulled into a new nightmare for no reason. She is being carried forward from the exact point where her story was left in pieces. That choice gives the writers a much stronger foundation because the audience does not have to relearn who she is or why her survival matters. The film can move straight into escalation. That escalation seems to have been the core creative idea from the beginning. Instead of repeating one family's private ritual, the sequel opens the door to a larger network of competing families and an inherited system of power centered on the high seat. That is a smart way to expand a horror world because it changes the scale without changing the emotional language. People are still hunting, lying, bargaining, and trying to survive. The difference is that the structure around them is bigger, stranger, and more organized. The movie is not leaving the original behind. It is revealing that the original was only one room in a much larger house. The creative team behind the sequel clearly understood that the biggest danger was over-explaining the mythology. If you give too much of the machinery away, the mystery evaporates. If you give too little, the audience feels cheated. The early descriptions of the film suggest a careful middle path, where the high seat and the rival families are introduced as enough of a framework to raise the stakes, but not so much that the sense of menace disappears. That balance is crucial. The best horror world building does not answer everything. It makes the audience imagine the part of the system that still remains hidden. The title also shows how the sequel was designed to echo the original while opening a new tonal lane. Here I Come sounds lighter and almost playful, but in this franchise that phrase becomes a threat wrapped in irony. The title suggests pursuit, arrival, and inevitability. It also feels like a child's game, which is exactly what makes it unsettling when attached to a story about violence and elite ritual. A title like that tells you the filmmakers understand the value of contrast. The scarier the premise becomes, the more useful it is to keep a little dark mischief in the wording. The director's return is another major part of the build. Matt Bettinelli, Olpin, and Tyler Gillett are not just continuing a franchise they helped create. They are returning to a tonal formula that depends on speed, rhythm, and the willingness to let absurdity and terror sit in the same frame. That is not easy to do twice. A first film can surprise people with a tone they did not expect. A sequel has to preserve that feeling while also giving viewers something new to latch onto. The fact that the sequel moved quickly into development suggests the studio understood the value of keeping the same creative voice in place. The writers also had a tricky job. They needed to build a sequel that could be understood by anyone who saw the first film, while still rewarding viewers who remember the details of Grace's ordeal. That means the script had to do two things at once. It had to catch up new viewers fast, and it had to deepen the mythology for returning ones. The simplest way to do that was through the sister relationship. Faith gives the movie a fresh emotional entry point, but because she is tied directly to Grace, the sequel never feels like it is starting from zero. That is efficient storytelling, and it keeps the momentum alive. One of the most appealing parts of this build is that the sequel seems to understand scale as an emotional tool, not just a marketing tool. Bigger does not automatically mean better. In horror, bigger can mean less tense if it starts to feel abstract. Here, though, the larger world appears to exist for one reason: to make Grace feel even more cornered. The rival families are not just extra villains. They are an extension of the same worldview that made the first movie so mean and funny. The difference is that the first family owned one mansion, while the sequel suggests a whole class structure built on the same rotten idea. That class structure is one of the cleverest parts of the sequel's design. The high seat implies lineage, succession, and a formal system of control, which is a much richer setup than a random group of rich psychos with a personal grudge. Now the horror has institutions behind it. That means every kill and every betrayal feels less like chaos and more like policy. Once a film gives its villains a system, the stakes become more chilling because the threat can survive individual defeats. You are not just fighting people, you are fighting a machine. The casting choices reinforce that logic. Samara Uiving, returning as Grace, keeps the emotional continuity intact, while Kэtrin Nьютon's faith adds both vulnerability and friction. Around them, the addition of names like Sara Mishel Gellar, Elijah Wood, and David Cronenberg signals a wider circle of personalities rather than a single family unit. That matters because each of those actors brings a different kind of screen history, and that history helps the film feel playful, dangerous, and unpredictable. The sequel seems to want its cast to do more than fill roles. It wants them to create the sense of a whole hidden ecosystem. There is also a practical side to how the sequel was built. The film was clearly shaped to preserve the momentum of the first installment while avoiding the trap of repeating its exact structure. That is why the opening story beats matter so much. Grace is not just back. She is back in motion, still carrying the trauma of what happened before, and immediately pulled into a new conflict that is personal and systemic at the same time. When a sequel can launch that fast, it keeps the audience from settling into comparison mode. Instead of asking whether the new film is identical, they start asking how far it can push the nightmare. The best sequels often succeed by making the viewer feel that the first film was a prologue to something bigger. That seems to be the exact strategy here. The sequel does not treat Grace's original escape as the end of a story. It treats it as the event that exposed a larger architecture of power. That is a strong build, because it redefines the original victory. Grace did not defeat the system, she only survived long enough to learn that the system had a second layer. Once the audience understands that, the sequel has a powerful engine running underneath every scene, and that engine is what gives the movie its identity. The story is built from pursuit, inheritance, and escalation. It has the comic cruelty of a social game, the panic of a chase film, and the awkward emotional weight of family conflict. Those pieces fit together because the filmmakers appear to have designed the sequel around pressure rather than exposition. They are not trying to lecture the audience about the world. They are trying to make the world feel like it is closing in. By the time you look at the sequel's basic structure, you can see why it had to be made the way it was. If it stayed too close to the original, it would feel unnecessary. If it drifted too far away, it would lose the qualities people loved in the first place. The chosen path is the harder one, but also the smarter one. Keep Grace, deepen the mythology, widen the circle of danger, and make the sibling bond the emotional anchor. That is how you build a sequel that still feels connected to its roots, while giving the audience a new nightmare to chase. The result is a film that seems to have been constructed like a trap. Every new detail narrows the escape routes instead of opening them. Every expansion in scale makes the threat feel more organized. Every returning element carries the memory of the first blood-soaked night. That is the real achievement of the sequel's design. It does not merely repeat the original's idea. It turns that idea into a larger world where survival is still possible, but never simple. What the film builds, in the end, is not just a bigger story. It is a harsher one. Grace now exists inside a system that knows her, remembers her, and wants her back. Faith gives that system something deeply human to exploit, and the high seat turns the whole thing into a contest with a crown at the center. That combination is what makes the sequel feel dangerous before it even reaches the halfway point. The build is complete when the audience realizes that the game was never just about winning. It was about discovering how many people were already playing before Grace ever got the invitation. At the center of Ready or Not, Here I Come is a simple but loaded idea. Survival is no longer a solo act. Grace is back, but she is not the same woman who stumbled into the first film's nightmare, and the sequel understands that instantly. She is now a person shaped by violence, suspicion, and unfinished trauma, which makes every choice feel heavier. That is the right place to start, because a sequel lives or dies by whether its returning hero still feels interesting once the shock of the first story is gone. Samara Uiving's Grace remains the emotional anchor of the whole film, and that is a difficult job to handle twice. In the first movie, Grace was a bride trying to survive a family ritual that turned into a blood hunt. In the sequel, she is no longer just reacting to a night of terror. She is carrying the memory of it, and the film appears to use that memory as part of her strength and her burden. That is important. If Grace were treated like a blank action heroine, the sequel would lose its soul. Instead, she seems to be written as someone whose humor, rage, and instinct for survival all come from pain. That kind of character is especially compelling in horror because it keeps the viewer uncertain about what she will do next. Grace is not only trying to live, she is trying to control a situation that has already proved it can strip control away in seconds. That makes her dangerous in the best possible way. She is smart enough to adapt, wounded enough to be volatile, and stubborn enough to keep moving even when everything around her says she should collapse. A character like that gives a sequel a pulse. Faith, played by Kэtrin Nьютон, is the sequel's smartest new addition. She is not just another ally to stand next to Grace in the middle of danger. She is Grace's estranged sister, which means the film adds a second emotional wound before the first chase even begins. Estrangement is powerful material in a horror story because it creates tension without requiring monsters. Two sisters who have unfinished history can wound each other with a look, a tone, or a half-finished sentence. When the world is already trying to kill them, that internal strain becomes even sharper. Faith also gives the sequel a new point of entry for the audience. Grace already belongs to the story. Faith has to be brought into it. That means she can carry the frustration, confusion, and resistance that a viewer might feel when they learn how much bigger this game has become. In a way, Faith becomes our guide into the sequel's broader world, while Grace becomes the person who understands too much and still cannot escape it. That pairing is elegant because it creates contrast. One sister is battle-hardened, the other is emotionally unresolved, and both are trapped in the same deadly structure. The emotional power of their relationship comes from the fact that it is not neat. There is no easy reconciliation built into a setup like this, and that is what makes it feel real. The sisters are connected by history, but history does not automatically create trust. In a film built around betrayal, loyalty is precious precisely because it is unstable. Grace may need faith. Faith may need grace. But need is not the same thing as forgiveness. The movie seems to understand that distinction, and it uses it to keep the relationship tense instead of sentimental. That tension becomes even more effective when you look at the wider cast. Sara Mishel Gellar's presence immediately adds a layer of recognizable star power. But more importantly, it suggests the film wants to play with audience expectations. Gellard has a long history with genre storytelling, so her inclusion alone can make viewers wonder whether her role will be heroic, sinister, or somewhere in between. That uncertainty is useful in a story where not everyone can be trusted. The same is true of Elijah Wood, David Cronenberg, Kevin Durand, Nestor Carbonell, Olivia Cheng, and Sean Hattasy. These are not flat background names. They are performers with strong screen identities, and a movie like this can use that to make every room feel unsafe. A cast like this also helps create the feeling of a larger social order. The film is not merely populating a house with victims and killers, it is presenting a network of people who may all be connected to the same system of power. That means each supporting character can serve as a clue to how the world operates. Are they enforcers, witnesses, manipulators, or true believers? The movie does not need to answer immediately. In fact, its power may depend on delay. When the audience cannot immediately classify a character, suspicion grows, and suspicion is one of the strongest fuels horror has. What is especially interesting about Grace and Faith together is the way they shift the sequel away from a simple, final girl versus enemies structure. The presence of a sister means the story now has room for grief, memory, resentment, and protection. Grace can be fierce, but her fierceness now matters to someone else. Faith can be guarded, but her guard may be the result of a life that taught her not to rely on anyone. That kind of dynamic turns a chase into a relationship drama with knives in it. It is a strong move because it keeps the film emotionally alive between the bursts of violence. There is also a subtle thematic point here. The first film was about a bride being absorbed into a brutal elite family and then rejecting that fate. The sequel broadens the lens by giving Grace a sibling she was separated from, which makes the story feel less like one person escaping a trap and more like damaged family ties being pulled back into view. That matters because horror often works best when it reveals how past abandonment shapes present danger. Grace and Faith are not random strangers thrown together by circumstance. They are people whose history has already taught them how hard it is to belong anywhere. This is why the ensemble matters so much. A cast with this much personality gives the movie texture. If every villain looked and sounded the same, the world would feel small. Instead, the sequel appears to surround Grace and Faith with people who each represent a different shade of threat. Some may be outwardly polished. Some may seem absurd. Some may feel cold and administrative, which can be even scarier than overt brutality. In a story about a hidden ruling structure, that range is essential. Power looks different from one person to the next, but it still comes from the same place. The returning directors also understand how to use cast chemistry as a weapon. These films do not work because every character gets a big speech. They work because the audience can feel tension before a word is spoken. A glance between Grace and Faith, a polite line from a stranger, a pause too long before answering a question, all of that becomes part of the danger. That is why ensemble horror lives or dies on casting. If the chemistry is wrong, the threat feels artificial. If the chemistry is right, even silence can start to feel like an attack. What the sequel seems to be doing, then, is building a hierarchy of relationships around Grace. faith is the closest one, and therefore, the most emotionally volatile. The new supporting characters widen the field, and each of them can either stabilize or destabilize the story. That layering gives the movie a lot of room to breathe, while still keeping the pressure tight. Grace is not just running from danger. She is navigating people, and people are often harder to predict than the violence itself. That is a key reason the cast matters so much in this kind of film. Horror fans do not only watch for kills, they watch to see who can be trusted, who will break, and who will reveal something unexpected under pressure. The sequel has enough well-known faces to make that game fun, but enough strange energy in the setup to keep it uneasy. That balance is hard to find. Too much familiarity and the film becomes comfortable. Too much anonymity and the tension disappears. So the real achievement of the cast is not just variety, it is tone. Grace and Faith carry the emotional pain. The surrounding players carry menace, ambiguity, and dark humor. Together they create the sense that this world is full of people who have already chosen sides, even if they have not said it out loud yet. That makes every scene feel charged. Even a casual conversation can sound like a warning. By the time the sequel puts all these pieces together, the characters begin to feel less like individuals in a chase and more like positions on a board. Grace is the survivor who now knows too much. Faith is the sister who may become her shield or her weakness. The supporting cast is the machinery of the larger game, each with the potential to turn the pressure in a new direction. That is good sequel design, because it lets the movie deepen its conflict without losing the fun of watching people try to outthink a nightmare. What gives this part of the film its force is the way it turns personality into survival strategy. Grace survives by being sharp, Faith survives by being guarded, and the people around them survive by whatever role the system has assigned them. In other words, the sequel is not just asking who these characters are. It is asking what kind of pressure they can endure before they become something else. That is the kind of question a strong horror sequel should ask, because once you understand the people, the danger becomes personal. The most exciting thing about Ready or Not, Here I Come, is that it stops behaving like a one-family horror story and starts revealing the shape of a whole hidden world. That shift changes everything. What once looked like an isolated blood ritual now feels like a system with rules, hierarchy, and reach far beyond one mansion. The sequel's real power comes from that expansion, because once the audience understands that the nightmare has an infrastructure, every scene gets heavier. The first film made the Ladomas family terrifying because their violence felt both ridiculous and absolute. They were rich, terrified, and absurdly committed to a pact they could not escape. The sequel takes that same energy and asks a much bigger question. What if the Ladomas family was only one branch of a larger order? What if there are other elite houses, other rituals, and other people willing to kill to preserve a system that benefits them? That is the kind of idea that can make a sequel feel genuinely larger instead of merely busier. The high seat is the clearest sign of that larger design. It sounds ceremonial, but it functions like a throne, which immediately tells you that the film is moving into territory shaped by power rather than random cruelty. A throne implies inheritance, rivalry, and legitimacy. It suggests that somebody sits at the top while everyone else competes for a place close enough to matter. That is a perfect horror concept, because it turns the movie into a contest where winning still feels poisonous. If the prize is control, then the cost of victory may be becoming part of the same ugly machine. This is why the sequel's world building works so well in concept. It does not simply add lore for the sake of lore. It uses the lore to make the danger feel more organized. When a villain has a personal grudge, the threat can be beaten in the moment. When a villain belongs to a larger network, the threat survives the moment. That distinction gives the film a darker mood, because Grace is no longer fighting one family's panic. She is pushing against an entire social order that has learned how to hide its violence behind wealth, ceremony, and inherited privilege. The rival families make that structure even more interesting. Instead of one group of hunters, the sequel suggests a competition between multiple elite dynasties, all moving toward the same prize. That means the conflict is not just between Grace and her enemies. It is between different versions of the same rotten world. Everyone involved seems to understand the rules, and that makes Grace's position even more dangerous. She is the one person in the middle who did not ask for any of this, which is exactly why she becomes the most unpredictable element in the whole system. That unpredictability gives the movie a strong dramatic edge. In a world of ritualized power, a survivor like Grace is disruptive. She does not belong to the code, and therefore she cannot be controlled as easily as the people born into it. The sequel seems to understand that her survival is not just a character trait, it is a threat to the people who rely on the system staying stable. Once a person survives the game and starts exposing it, the whole structure has to react. That reaction is where a lot of the tension comes from. Faith adds another layer to that hidden world because she is not simply a witness. She is a personal tie to Grace that the larger system can exploit. Her presence, says the sequel, is interested in how private relationships get warped when they are dragged into public power struggles. Sisters are not supposed to be collateral damage in a political contest, but in this universe, that is exactly what they become. The movie uses that discomfort well. It makes the big world feel cruel by showing how quickly it reaches into the smallest, most vulnerable parts of a person's life. There is also a subtle class argument inside the film's setup. Wealth in this world is not just money. It is access, protection, and the right to make violence look like tradition. The high seat sounds noble, but the premise makes it clear that the system beneath it is built on fear and obedience. That gives the film a sharper edge than a standard slasher sequel. The horror is not only that people are being hunted. The horror is that the hunt is normalized among the people with the most power. This kind of world building works because it is legible without becoming mechanical. The audience does not need a full history lecture to understand that a throne, rival families, and a hidden council imply a structure of control. The filmmakers can let the visuals, the behavior, and the dialogue do the work. A glance, a ceremony, a guarded phrase, all of it can suggest layers of meaning. That economy is important. If the film overexplains its mythology, it risks draining the fear. If it underexplains everything, the world becomes empty. The strongest horror stories leave just enough unanswered that the audience keeps filling in the blanks. The hidden world also makes the sequel feel more modern in a nasty way. The first film was a contained nightmare about inherited wealth and family pressure. The sequel suggests something broader and colder, a network of elites connected by old agreements and mutual self-protection. That gives the story a sense of scale that mirrors real social anxieties. People understand the fear of institutions that protect themselves. They understand how ritual can disguise abuse. The movie taps into that instinct without turning into a lecture, which is why the concept lands so well. One of the smartest moves in the sequel is that it keeps the hidden world strange instead of making it sleek. It would be easy to portray this system as elegant and polished, but horror works better when the machinery feels just off enough to be disturbing. The idea of elite families competing for a seat of power has a fairy tale quality on the surface, but once violence enters the frame, the fantasy collapses into something ugly. That contrast is delicious in a horror comedy, because it lets the film mock the grandiosity of its own villains while still taking their power seriously. The existence of rival families also means the film can explore different shades of complicity. Some people may be true believers. Others may be opportunists. Others may simply fear what happens if they refuse to participate. That variation matters because evil is more frightening when it is not all the same shape. A story like this becomes richer when the audience sees how many ways a person can support a corrupt system. Not everyone needs to be a screaming villain. Some can be calm, polite, and fully committed to the rules. That can be even worse. Grace, in that context, becomes an outsider in the best sense. She is not trying to inherit the system. She is trying to survive it. That makes her dangerous to the hidden world, because she reveals how brittle its rituals really are. If enough pressure is applied, the mask slips. If enough resistance appears, the code begins to break. That is a classic horror power dynamic. But it works especially well here because the story is built around class privilege and inherited control. The game may look ancient, but the fear underneath it feels immediate. This hidden structure also gives the sequel room for visual and tonal contrasts. A polished room can contain a brutal practice. A formal phrase can hide a threat. A ritual can be staged with elegance and still be grotesque. Those contrasts are part of what makes the concept memorable. The movie is not just showing violence, it is showing violence that has been dressed up as order. That is a deeply unpleasant idea, and that is exactly why it works. The more you think about it, the more the high seat feels like the sequel's central symbol. It is not just a prize, it is a summary of the whole world. Whoever reaches it gains legitimacy, but that legitimacy is built on the suffering of everyone who had to be eliminated along the way. That is a beautifully ugly idea for a horror film. It turns the social ladder into a slaughterhouse. It also gives the story a clean visual anchor, something the audience can keep returning to every time the stakes need to rise. By building this hidden world, the sequel makes the original film's ending feel less like closure and more like exposure. Grace did not simply escape evil. She uncovered the first visible layer of a much larger design. That realization is what gives the sequel its narrative urgency. The world did not end when the first family fell apart. It just revealed how many other people were ready to step into the gap. That is a chilling thought, and it is the kind that keeps a franchise alive long after the first blood has dried. In the end, the hidden world behind the game is what gives Ready or Not. Here, I Come its strongest identity. It is not merely a sequel about more killing. It is a sequel about discovering that the killing was always part of a larger order. Once the audience understands that, every pursuit, every alliance, and every betrayal becomes more meaningful. The film stops being a one-night chase and becomes a map of power built on fear. That is a much scarier place to be, because now Grace is not just running from the hunters. She is running through the bones of the system itself. The plot of Ready or Not. Here I Come works because it does not build tension from mystery alone. It builds tension from pressure, speed, and the terrible feeling that Grace keeps being pulled back into a fight she already survived once. That makes the story easier to follow and harder to shake off. You do not need to understand every layer of the world immediately to feel the danger, because the movie keeps the emotional logic simple. Grace wants to live, Faith wants to live, the system wants them both inside it. The sequel starts from the aftermath of survival, which is a smart move, because survival is often treated like a finish line when it is really the beginning of a new kind of fear. Grace survived the first ordeal, but that does not mean she has escaped its consequences. In this story, she is pulled into a fresh confrontation with a wider network of elite families, and the hunt is now tied to the high seat, a prize that suggests a whole political order behind the bloodshed. That shift changes the emotional texture of the film. The danger is no longer random. It is organized. That organization matters because it gives the plot a tighter shape. The earlier film was a survival nightmare inside one house and one family's ritual. The sequel takes the same basic idea and turns it into a race against a larger machine, which means every movement Grace makes feels watched. The stakes become less about escaping a room and more about escaping a system that has already decided the terms of the game. Once that happens, the plot stops being a series of isolated scares and becomes a sustained chase with purpose. Faith's presence deepens the plot in a very practical way. She is not only an emotional addition. She is the reason the story has a second heartbeat. Because she is Grace's estranged sister, the plot can move between action and relationship conflict without losing momentum. Their bond gives the screenplay a way to slow down for a second and then hit harder. A glance between them can carry as much weight as a scream from someone chasing them. That is the kind of writing that keeps a sequel from feeling flat. The strongest part of the plot structure is the way it combines urgency with reveal. The film does not need to dump every rule at once. Instead, it lets the audience discover that the threat is larger as Grace discovers it. That keeps the pacing alive. If the story explained the whole world in one stretch, the tension would leak out. By revealing the scope piece by piece, the movie lets each new detail sharpen the danger. The high seat, the rival families, and the hidden hierarchy all become more frightening because Grace has to react to them in real time. There is also a very clear survival logic at the center of the story. Grace is not being asked to solve a puzzle in the abstract. She is being forced to make decisions while hunted, cornered, and pulled into conflicts that existed before she arrived. That means every choice is expensive. Trust the wrong person and you die. Hesitate and someone else gets ahead of you. Protect faith and you may expose yourself. Run alone and you may lose the one person who can help you. A plot like that creates moral pressure, which is often more compelling than simple physical danger. One of the film's best plot moves is that it expands the scale without losing the basic chase structure. That is harder than it sounds. Many sequels become bloated when they try to widen the mythology. This one appears to keep the story moving by making the characters' immediate problem always clear. They are hunted. They are outnumbered. The rules are changing. The audience never loses sight of that, even as the larger world becomes more visible. The result is a plot that feels both bigger and leaner at the same time. The story also gains force from how it treats Grace as a player who never wanted to join the game, but now understands its language too well. That creates a sharp dramatic tension. She knows enough to survive, but not enough to control what is happening. That position is perfect for a sequel, because it lets the character be competent without becoming invincible. If Grace were too passive, the film would stall. If she were too powerful, the danger would disappear. Instead, she occupies the narrow space between experience and helplessness, and that is where the best suspense lives. Faith's role in the survival stakes is especially important because it raises the emotional cost of failure. If Grace dies, the story is tragic. If Faith dies, Grace loses more than a partner. She loses the chance to repair a damaged family tie under impossible conditions. That makes every threat feel sharper. A chase is one thing. A chase where the person beside you is your estranged sister is another thing entirely. The plot uses that relationship to turn physical danger into emotional danger, which is why the film can keep escalating without feeling repetitive. What also helps is the film's use of inheritance as a plot engine. The rival families are not just competing for land, money, or revenge. They are competing for control of a system that appears to define legitimacy itself. That means the plot is built around succession, which is a classic source of tension, because it automatically creates winners, losers, and desperate behavior. Once people believe a throne is available, they will reveal who they really are. The sequel seems to use that idea to keep every interaction charged with motive. The plot's pacing, according to early reactions, is one of its biggest strengths. That makes sense, because a story like this cannot afford to drift. It needs to move like a pursuit, not a lecture. The audience should feel that there is always another corner to turn, another threat to discover, another piece of the system closing in. When a horror sequel maintains that rhythm, it becomes much easier to forgive familiar elements. You are not watching for novelty alone, you are watching to see how the pressure changes. There is also a nice irony in the way the plot uses the idea of winning. On paper, the winner of the game gains the high seat and the power that comes with it. In practice, the story makes it feel like victory may be its own form of corruption. That is a very strong horror comedy idea, because it lets the film mock the arrogance of its villains while still treating their power as real. The plot does not need to say that winning is meaningless. It only needs to show that any prize built on this much violence is already rotten. The central action beats seem designed to keep Grey's in motion while revealing just enough of the larger order to deepen the stakes. That is why the story works better when described as a pressure cooker than a mystery box. The important thing is not whether the audience can recite every rule. The important thing is that they understand what is at risk when Grace and Faith try to stay alive. The plot keeps reminding you that the system is watching, and the system does not like people who refuse to play by its rules. What makes the survival stakes so effective is that they are both personal and structural. Grace wants to live. Faith wants to live. But their survival also threatens a larger arrangement of power that depends on obedience and silence. That means the film can play on two levels at once. On one level, it is a chase. On another, it is a rebellion. Even if Grace never sets out to become a rebel. That accidental uprising quality is part of what gives the plot its energy. The deeper you go into the story, the more it feels like every path has been designed to lead Grace back into conflict. That is why the plot feels inescapable. It is not simply that she is unlucky, it is that the world around her has been built to absorb people like her back into the game. The sequel understands that the scariest kind of trap is not one with bars, it is one that looks like choice, until you realize all the exits point inward. In the end, the plot of Ready or Not, Here I Come succeeds because it treats survival as a moving target. Grace cannot simply survive the opening and then relax. She has to keep adjusting as the world around her reveals new levels of danger. Faith makes the journey more emotional. The high seat makes it more political. The rival families make it more unpredictable. Put together, those elements create a story that is not just about getting out alive. It is about understanding that getting out may never have been the point the system was built for. The visual style of Ready or Not, Here I Come has to do a very specific job. It must make the world feel polished enough to be believable, but ugly enough to remind you that every elegant surface is hiding something rotten. That contrast is the soul of the franchise's look. The first film made a mansion feel like a death trap dressed as privilege, and the sequel seems to widen that idea into a larger network of wealth and ritual. The result is not just a prettier horror movie. It is a sharper one. What makes the imagery so important is that the movie's concept depends on visual contradiction. A formal room can hold panic. A graceful costume can be soaked in chaos. a candlelit space can become a battlefield in seconds. That kind of style works because it keeps the audience slightly off balance. If everything looked grim all the time, the impact would shrink. By allowing beauty to exist right next to brutality, the film makes every violent moment feel more perverse. That is exactly the right tone for a sequel about rich families playing for power. The action language of the film is built around speed and confusion, but not sloppy confusion. It needs to be readable enough that the audience always knows who is chasing whom, yet chaotic enough to make every escape feel desperate. That balance is one of the hardest things in horror action. If the camera stays too still, the sequence loses adrenaline. If it moves too wildly, the danger stops being clear. The sequel appears to keep the same sharp energy that made the original work, which means the action likely feels sharp, propulsive, and mean. That means the movie's action is not just about spectacle, it is about character pressure. Grace does not fight like someone in an action franchise who was born for combat. She fights like a person who has learned, through terrible necessity, how to survive a nightmare. That difference matters. Every stumble, every improvised weapon, every split-second decision tells you something about her state of mind. She is not performing heroism, she is reacting under extreme pressure, and that makes the violence feel more desperate and more human. Faith changes the action rhythm in a useful way. Once Grace is not alone, the movie can create moments where cooperation matters as much as instinct. That opens the door to chase sequences, split-second rescues, and scenes where one sister's mistake can put the other in danger. The visual challenge there is to keep both women distinct in the frame while still making them feel bound together by the same thread. That kind of action staging is not just technical. It supports the emotion of the story. Two characters running together can say more than a speech ever could. The gore, of course, is part of the franchise's identity, but the best horror gore is never just there to shock. It has to feel like a consequence of the story's world. In a film about elite families and a deadly competition, violence becomes the language of the system itself. That means the gore is not random decoration. It is a way of showing how deeply the rules have corrupted everyone involved. When the movie leans into blood and injury, it is making the horror visible instead of abstract. That said, the sequel seems to understand the value of control. If every sequence were maxed out at the same level of brutality, the audience would get numb. The strongest gore scenes in a movie like this usually land because the film first creates tension, then releases it in a sudden burst. That rhythm matters. You feel the impact more when the movie gives you a moment of anticipation right before the violence hits. The sequel's pacing suggests it knows how to use that timing well, which is why the violence can feel both funny and nasty at once. One of the reasons the original film worked so well was that its violence often had a darkly comic shape to it. The sequel seems to keep that spirit alive, which means the bloodshed is likely framed with a kind of cruel wit. That is not the same as making light of the danger. It means the film understands how absurd the situation is, even while treating the harm seriously. A person slipping out of a formal room covered in blood can be horrifying and ridiculous in the same breath. That tonal mix is hard to pull off, but it is also what gives this franchise its personality. The sequel's wider world also gives the filmmakers more chances to vary the visual palette. Different families, different spaces, and different power settings can each carry their own texture. One location may feel cold and ceremonial, another may feel lavish and suffocating, and another may feel like a place where violence is expected rather than hidden. That variety matters because it prevents the film from feeling visually trapped in the memory of the first one. The sequel can honor the original style while expanding the look into something broader and more politically charged. Costume and production design are likely doing a lot of work here, even when the movie is not drawing attention to them directly. In a story about wealth and power, clothing and interiors are never neutral. They are signals. A formal jacket, a polished room, or a ceremonial object can tell the viewer who belongs to the system and who is being swallowed by it. That makes the visuals part of the storytelling, not just the decoration around it. A horror sequel built on class tension needs that kind of precision. The action also benefits from contrast between stillness and movement. The quieter moments are where the film can let dread settle in. A hallway with no one in it can be more frightening than a bloodbath if the audience knows someone is coming. Then, when the violence arrives, the burst feels bigger. That kind of rhythm is essential to a film like this. It keeps the viewer alert. It also makes the gore feel earned, because the movie has done the work of suspense before it pays off with carnage. Another strength of the visual approach is that it can make power feel physical. Thrones, rooms, doors, hallways, and ceremonial spaces are not just backgrounds. They are part of the power structure. When a character stands in a space built to impress, the frame itself can make them look trapped. That is a very useful horror image. It says that the environment is not passive. It is actively participating in the domination of the people inside it. That idea fits the sequel's world perfectly, because the whole story is about hidden systems that keep people in line. The gore then becomes the moment when that polished surface finally breaks. Blood on expensive clothes, shattered decor, and ruined formal spaces create the exact kind of visual irony that horror fans love. The movie can turn beauty into wreckage in seconds, and that transformation is part of the pleasure. It tells the audience that no amount of wealth can protect the people inside this system from the consequences of the game they created. That is not just satisfying. It is thematically perfect. What makes this sequel especially promising on the visual front is that it seems to understand restraint as well as excess. The best horror action does not go full speed all the time. It saves its strongest images for the right moments. That means a single brutal shot can carry more weight than a whole sequence of random carnage. If the film keeps that discipline, its gore will feel memorable instead of merely noisy. That is how a movie sticks in people's minds after the credits roll. Grace's visual journey is probably one of the most important parts of the sequel's style. She is a character whose appearance can change as the night gets worse, and that visual degradation tells the story without extra explanation. The same is true of Faith, whose presence adds a second layer of emotional and visual vulnerability. When two sisters are dragged through the same nightmare, the movie can show their bond through mirrored damage, shared exhaustion, and the way they physically move through the frame together. The final effect of all this is that the film's style does not just support the story. It is the story in visual form. The elegance, the violence, the speed, and the gore all point to the same idea. This world is designed to look controlled, but it is actually built on panic and blood. The more beautiful the frame, the more disturbing the damage inside it. That is exactly why this kind of horror works so well when the filmmakers stay disciplined. In the end, the visual style, action, and gore of Ready or Not, Here I Come seem built around one central promise. The sequel wants to be beautiful enough to draw you in, fast enough to keep you moving, and bloody enough to leave a mark. That is a powerful combination. It means the movie is not just asking you to watch people survive. It is asking you to feel how ugly power becomes when it has to hide behind elegance. The production story behind Ready or Not, Here I Come matters because this is the kind of sequel that depends on timing, trust, and creative control. When a horror film returns to a world like this, the production has to preserve the original energy without turning the whole thing into a copy. That is easier said than done. A sequel can only feel alive if the people making it still seem excited by the nightmare they are building. And this one appears to have had that advantage from the start. One reason the production feels significant is that the original film gave the filmmakers a clear identity to protect. The first movie was memorable because it blended horror, humor, and social bite in a way that felt fresh. If the follow-up had been made by people who misunderstood that balance, it could have turned into something flat or overly polished. Instead, the return of Matt Bettinelli-Olpin and Tyler Gillett suggests a production committed to continuity of voice, as much as continuity of story, that matters in a film where tone is everything. The move from the first film's contained setting to the sequel's expanded world likely created one of the main production challenges. A larger mythology means more moving parts, more characters, and more places to stage the action. That sounds exciting, but it also means the crew has to keep the story clear while making it feel broader. Horror films often lose power when they become too spread out. The challenge here was to expand the universe without diluting the claustrophobic pressure that made the original so effective. That pressure probably affected every part of the shoot. A film like this depends heavily on timing, because the audience needs to feel that the chase is always active, even when the characters are not running. That means the production team had to think carefully about staging, camera movement, and how to keep each sequence visually readable under stress. Action scenes in horror are not just about movement. They are about control over chaos. The camera must let you understand what is happening while still making you feel that the characters themselves are losing control. The cast size also adds a real production burden. With names like Samara Uiving, Kэtrин Nьютон, Sara Mишель Gellar, Elijah Wood, David Cronenberg, Kevin Durant, Nestor Carbonell, Olivia Chang, and Sean Hattasy, the film needs to give each performer enough space to matter. That is not easy in a thriller where the plot moves quickly. Every extra character can become a logistical problem if the screenplay does not balance them well. The production challenge is therefore not just physical. It is structural. The movie has to stay tight while still making the ensemble feel alive. The return of Samara Uiving is especially important from a production point of view. A sequel like this depends on a lead actor who can carry the audience's memory of the first film without feeling trapped by it. Uiving has to be both familiar and fresh. She has to embody Grace as a survivor, while still allowing new layers to emerge from the trauma she has already lived through. That kind of performance is hard to support unless the production is carefully designed around her timing, her reactions, and the emotional rhythm of each scene. Kэtrin Nьютон's role as Faith likely created its own set of challenges. Because the sister relationship is central to the sequel, the production needed the actors to establish chemistry quickly and convincingly. That is not only about dialogue, it is about how they move together, how they avoid one another, and how much damage sits underneath every exchange. In a horror film, those details can matter more than plot mechanics. If the chemistry is off, the emotional spine of the movie weakens. If it works, the whole story feels more dangerous. The expanded mythology around the High Seat and the rival families also likely required careful design in pre-production. Concepts like that can easily become vague if they are not translated into strong visual rules. That means the production likely had to decide how these families look, how their spaces differ, and how their status is communicated on screen. Those are not decorative decisions. They help the audience understand the world without stopping the story to explain it. For a horror sequel, that kind of clarity is priceless. Another likely challenge was maintaining the franchise's darkly comic tone while raising the stakes. Once a sequel becomes bigger, there is always a danger that it will start taking itself too seriously. But this story needs its humor. The comedy is part of what makes the violence land. If the production pushed the film too far toward grimness, it could lose the sharp edge that made the first movie memorable. That means the direction, editing, and performances all had to work together to keep the movie funny without softening the horror. The practical side of gore also matters here. A film that relies on blood and injury has to plan those effects carefully so they feel impactful rather than repetitive. That means physical effects, makeup, props, and post-production all have to be in sync. If the violence looks fake or overdone, it breaks the spell. If it looks too neat, it loses its bite. The production challenge is to make the gore feel sudden and ugly in the moment, while still keeping the overall film stylish enough to match the franchise's tone. There is also the challenge of scale. A sequel set in a wider world can easily become expensive-looking in a way that undercuts intimacy. Horror often works best when the audience feels trapped with the characters. Production design, lighting, and blocking all have to support that feeling, even if the world itself is bigger. The movie needs to suggest a larger system without making the viewer feel safe inside it. That is a difficult balance. Because the larger the story becomes, the easier it is for the tension to leak away. The reported quick development of the sequel suggests that the production team saw momentum as a priority. That can be a good thing in a horror franchise, because a long delay sometimes causes the original excitement to fade. But speed also creates pressure. When a sequel moves fast, the creative team has to make confident decisions about cast, tone, and story structure sooner than they might want. That kind of pressure can either sharpen the film or strain it. In this case, the early response suggests the filmmakers found a workable path. A production like this also has to manage audience memory. The first film already existed in people's heads, and that means the sequel cannot simply recreate the same emotional rhythm. The challenge is to honor the original while not becoming trapped by it. That may be why the sequel leans into a broader conspiracy and a more formal power structure. It gives the filmmakers room to do something familiar in spirit but different in shape. That kind of evolution is often the safest way to keep a franchise from feeling stale. The director's experience with ensemble horror probably helped here. A story with this many moving pieces needs confidence behind the camera. Actors have to know when to play fear straight, when to lean into absurdity, and when to let the scene breathe. The production challenge is not just getting good performances. It is making sure those performances fit together as one rhythm. A horror comedy collapses if the beat is off by even a little. The sequel therefore likely benefited from a crew that understood the timing of tension as well as the mechanics of production. Filming challenges would also include keeping the action legible in scenes with multiple characters and shifting alliances. That sounds simple until you try to stage it. Who is in danger? Who is hiding? Who is lying? If the shot design is unclear, the audience gets lost. If the sequence is too clean, the chase loses urgency. The production has to constantly answer those questions in visual form. That is one reason action horror shoots are so demanding. They require both precision and chaos at the same time. One more challenge is tonal consistency across the ensemble. When a film brings together actors with different genre backgrounds and screen personas, it has to make sure the overall mood does not fracture. Some performers naturally lean dramatic. Others bring a sharper comic edge. the production must shape all of that into one unified voice. That takes rehearsal, direction, and often a lot of editing. If it works, the cast feels larger than life. If it fails, the movie can feel like different films stitched together. In a sequel like this, the production itself becomes part of the story's meaning. A hidden world of elites, rituals, and violent competition requires a filmmaking process that is precise, controlled, and aware of its own systems. That is almost a mirror of the fictional world. The movie is about people trapped in a structure they did not build, and the production has to build that structure convincingly enough for the audience to believe it. That is a demanding task, but it is also what makes the film interesting behind the scenes. By the end, the production story suggests a sequel made by people who knew exactly what they were protecting. They had to keep the humor, keep the violence, keep the pressure, and keep Grace believable as a survivor who never got to stop surviving. They also had to widen the world without losing the knife-edge intimacy of the original. That combination is hard enough in theory. On a set, with cast, crew, schedules, and effects all pulling together, it becomes a real test. The fact that the movie exists at all in this shape tells you the production had to be careful, disciplined, and willing to trust the franchise's strange, bloody identity. The creative choices behind Ready or Not, Here I Come matter because this sequel lives or dies on voice. A horror comedy about rich families, inherited violence, and a survivor dragged back into a larger game only works if the people steering it know exactly how much to push, how much to hold back, and when to let the absurdity cut through the fear. That is why the return of Matt Bettinelli-Olpin and Tyler Gillett is such a big deal. They are not just continuing a story, they are preserving a very specific creative temperature. The director's biggest creative decision is to keep the sequel anchored in Grace while widening the world around her. That might sound obvious, but it is actually a delicate choice. Many sequels try to impress viewers by making the universe bigger and accidentally weaken the emotional center. Here, the film seems to understand that the audience is not coming back for lore alone. They are coming back for Grace's energy, her instincts, and the specific way the original film used her as both victim and weapon. Preserving that center is the smartest creative move the sequel can make. The writers, Guy Busick and R. Christopher Moore, face the harder version of the same task. They have to make the sequel feel like an expansion, not an imitation. That means the script needs to answer one question repeatedly: what is the new layer of danger? The answer appears to be a broader network of rival families, a governing high seat, and a world in which the original nightmare was only one branch of something much larger. That is the kind of creative decision that gives a sequel weight without forcing it to abandon its roots. One of the best creative choices is the use of faith. In a less thoughtful sequel, the new character might have been a convenient helper with a few functional scenes. Instead, the choice to make her Grace's estranged sister gives the story immediate emotional tension. That matters because horror gets stronger when the danger is mixed with old wounds. Grace and Faith can argue, protect, mistrust, and reconnect in ways that are all relevant to survival. The writers are not just adding a character, they are adding history. Their choices also reveal something important about the director's understanding of pacing. If you want a sequel to stay sharp, you cannot rely only on action beats. You need personal friction. Faith provides that friction. The relationship gives the movie a way to slow down for a moment without losing momentum, because every line between the sisters can carry emotional weight. That is smart creative design. It lets the film breathe while still keeping the knife at the throat. Another strong choice is the move from a private family ritual to a larger system of power. This is where the writers show restraint. They do not seem to be turning the story into a lecture about society. Instead, they are using a frightening structure, the high seat and the rival families, to let the audience feel how corruption spreads. That is better storytelling than a pile of exposition. The audience learns the world through consequences, not through speeches. The directors also appear to understand how to use comedy without undercutting the horror. That is one of the hardest creative balances in modern genre filmmaking. If the movie leans too far into jokes, the danger becomes soft. If it leans too far into grimness, it loses the savage fun that made the first film stand out. The creative choice here seems to be to let the violence itself carry the humor. That is a very sharp move, because it keeps the tone mean and playful at the same time. The script structure likely benefits from another important choice, which is to keep the audience close to Grace's point of view. That matters, because a story like this could easily become too complicated if it spread attention across the whole conspiracy. Instead, the creative focus stays on the person trying to survive the conspiracy. That keeps the emotional thread intact. The bigger the world gets, the more the script needs one character whose confusion, anger, and determination can hold everything together. There is also an interesting creative choice in how the sequel handles familiarity. It clearly wants to remind viewers of the original film's energy, but it cannot simply copy the setup and hope nostalgia does the rest. So the writers and directors appear to shift the terrain while preserving the mood. Instead of another one-house hunt, the sequel introduces a wider hunt with a stronger political shape. That is a way of saying the same kind of story in a new language. Good sequels do that. They rhyme with the original instead of repeating it line for line. The addition of performers like Sara Mishel Gellar, Elijah Wood, and David Cronenberg also suggests a deliberate creative strategy. These are not random names. They each bring a kind of genre memory that can enrich the film's atmosphere. A director who understands casting as storytelling knows that star presence can do half the work before a character even speaks. That is likely part of the creative thinking here. The ensemble is not just there to fill the frame. It helps create the sense of a world with history, status, and hidden motives. Another important choice is the way the sequel seems to treat violence as a social ritual rather than only a physical event. There is a subtle but meaningful distinction. A random kill is shocking. A kill that feels tied to a rule, a rank, or a ceremony is more disturbing because it suggests the violence is justified by the world itself. The writers seem to understand that this is where the real horror lives. The violence is not accidental, it is structured. That makes it feel harder to escape. The creative team also appears to have chosen momentum over mystery for its own sake. That does not mean the film gives everything away. It means the film likely trusts the audience to keep up while the characters are in motion. That is, the characters are in motion. Is a confident choice. A weaker sequel would over-explain the setting in the hope of making it feel grand. A stronger one lets action and emotion reveal the rules naturally. That seems to be the path here, and it fits the franchise's personality well. One of the nicest creative details is the way the title itself sets a tone. Here I Come is playful, almost childish, but in this context, it becomes threatening. That choice is not accidental. It tells you the film wants irony right from the start. The creators are leaning into the idea that a simple phrase can become horrifying when attached to the wrong world. That is the kind of tonal play that makes a horror comedy memorable. It signals danger while inviting the audience to enjoy the wicked joke. The directors also seem to know when to let the movie be ugly. Some horror creators try to make every bloody moment stylish. Others go so far into realism that the fun disappears. The creative choice here appears to be a middle path. make the violence feel nasty, sudden, and consequence-driven, but still keep enough wit in the frame that the audience can laugh at the absurdity of rich people turning murder into a game. That is a hard balance, but it is exactly the sort of thing Bettinelli, Olpin, and Gillett have handled well before. Faith's role also reflects a larger creative idea about family. The film is not just about inherited power, it is about inherited damage. By making Grace's sibling central to the sequel, the writers create an emotional mirror for the story's themes. Family is both the source of pain and the only possible source of rescue. That contradiction gives the movie more depth than a simple survival thriller. It allows the story to ask whether trust can survive trauma, which is a much more interesting question than whether the characters can outrun a hallway of killers. Another creative strength is the sequel's willingness to keep the original film's mean streak. That sounds simple, but it is a real choice. Many follow-ups soften the edges of a successful first film because they want broader appeal. This story does not seem interested in becoming nicer. It keeps the social satire sharp, the elite behavior grotesque, and the survival stakes nasty. That is the right move, because the audience returns to this franchise for the feeling that civility is only a thin coat of paint over something rotten. The filmmakers also appear to trust visual storytelling over heavy explanation. That is a creative decision that pays off in a horror film because the image can do work the dialogue should not have to do. A sealed room, a formal object, a blood-stained costume, a look exchanged between characters, all of these can tell the audience where power sits. The script and direction seem built around that idea. Show the system, let the audience feel it, and then let Grace break through it under pressure. In the end, the creative choices behind Ready or Not. Here I Come reveal a sequel made by people who understand the original's identity and know how risky it is to tamper with that identity. They have chosen expansion without abandoning intimacy, comedy without losing menace, and mythology without drowning the story in explanation. That combination is why the film has the potential to work. It is not trying to become a different franchise. It is trying to become a deeper version of the same nightmare. What stands out most is the confidence behind those choices. The film seems to believe that audiences will follow Grace anywhere, as long as the world stays sharp, the emotions stay real, and the danger keeps feeling earned. That belief is a creative choice too. It says the filmmakers trust the material, trust the cast, and trust the audience to enjoy a sequel that is mean, smart, and just ridiculous enough to be fun. The deepest strength of Ready or Not, Here I Come, is that its horror is not just about blood. It is about who gets to organize the blood, who benefits from it, and who is forced to live inside the system that produces it. That is why the sequel's themes feel bigger than the plot itself. The high seat is not only a prize, it is a symbol of class power, inherited privilege, and the ugly way elites can turn violence into tradition. Once you see that, the movie stops being only a chase story and starts becoming a story about the architecture of power. The first film already had this idea baked into it. The Ladomas family were wealthy people, trapped inside a ritual that they treated like sacred family business. The sequel expands that into a more organized social order, which makes the class commentary sharper. The rival families are not random villains. They are competing branches of the same rotten tree. That matters. Because it shows, the film is not interested in saying that one rich family is bad. It is saying the system itself is rotten, and the families are simply different ways of preserving it. The high seat is the perfect symbol for that idea. A seat sounds like something formal, even respectable. A high seat sounds like a place of honor. But in this film, that language hides a brutal truth. The seat exists because people have been killed, manipulated, and sorted through a ritual of survival. That contradiction is powerful. It shows how language can clean up violence so it feels noble. The movie keeps reminding you that power likes to dress itself up. That is one reason the sequel's premise is so nasty in a good way. It knows that the most dangerous systems are often the ones that look ceremonial. Grace's role in the theme is especially important because she is not part of this elite world by birth or desire. She is an outsider who survives long enough to expose the machinery behind the game. That makes her a threat to the ruling class in a way they cannot fully control. Outsiders are dangerous in stories like this because they do not automatically respect the ritual. They see the blood under the tablecloth. Grace can move through the system, but she does not belong to it, and that distinction gives the movie its strongest emotional and political edge. Faith adds another thematic layer because she shows how class violence does not only hit strangers. It also tears through family, memory, and emotional history. The sister relationship suggests that even the people closest to Grace are vulnerable to the same forces that try to trap her. That makes the theme more intimate. The film is not saying class power lives only in boardrooms and mansions. It is saying it reaches into childhood, abandonment, and the bonds between people who should have been protected. That is a much crueler idea, and it gives the sequel more depth. One of the most compelling things about the theme of class power in this movie is the way the rich are portrayed as both absurd and deadly. They are ridiculous because their rituals are grotesque and self-important. They are dangerous because their wealth gives them the ability to turn ritual into law. That mix is exactly what satire should do. It makes the elite look foolish, but it never lets the audience forget that foolish people with power can still destroy lives. In that sense, the movie is funny only because it is so sharp about real social fear. The film's broader world makes the class theme even stronger because it suggests that power is not accidental here. It is inherited, protected, and renewed through violence. A throne only matters if enough people believe in the system that supports it. The high seat, therefore, becomes a symbol of continuity. The wealthy are not just hoarding money. They are preserving a structure that lets them keep deciding who wins and who dies. That is why the sequel feels more political than the first film, even when it stays playful on the surface. This is also why the movie's violence has thematic weight. Every kill is part of a social mechanism. Every wound is evidence that the system has to harm people to survive itself. Horror often becomes more meaningful when it reveals the logic behind the brutality. Here, the logic is that power must be defended, and defense means blood. That is a grim idea, but it is exactly what gives the movie its bite. The horror is not random, it is structural. The class commentary also works because the film keeps the rich spaces visually distinct from Grace and Faith's emotional reality. Wealth in this universe is polished, ceremonial, and designed to feel permanent. But the people moving through it are fragile, frightened, and desperate. That contrast says a lot without requiring speeches. The rich build monuments to themselves. The survivors move through them like people trying to escape a trap. That visual difference is a major part of how the theme lands. Another reason the theme of class power resonates is that the movie refuses to make the elites purely monstrous in a cartoonish sense. They are monstrous, yes, but they are also organized, calm, and comfortable inside the rules they helped create. That makes them scarier. A screaming villain can be defeated in a scene. A polite system that keeps reproducing itself is much harder to beat. That is why the sequel's hidden world structure feels so effective. It shows how power survives by becoming normal. The theme of survival also changes when viewed through class. Grace surviving is not just a personal victory. It is a disruption of the order the rich depend on. That is a powerful narrative move because it turns the final girl into a symbolic threat. She is proof that the ritual is not perfect, that the system can be broken, and that the people at the bottom can still outlive the people at the top. That kind of victory is deeply satisfying because it carries social meaning, not just physical escape. The high seat also invites a very pointed question about legitimacy. Who deserves to rule a system built on murder? The film's answer is obviously nobody, but the symbolic question matters. The elite in this world behave as though control can be earned through endurance, as if surviving the game proves worthiness. That is a deeply corrupt idea, and the sequel seems eager to expose it. The throne does not sanctify the winner. It exposes the rot beneath the victory. Faith's role reinforces that idea because she is not simply there to support Grace. She is there to reveal how personal history and social history get tangled together. The sisters are survivors of damage that predates the current crisis. That means the class theme is not just about the wealthy. It is also about what happens to people whose lives have already been shaped by instability and loss. In that sense, the film connects private pain with larger structures of control. It shows that power does not only injure bodies, it injures relationships. The sequel also has a strong undercurrent of irony about inheritance. The rich inherit wealth, status, and ritual. Grace inherits trauma, vigilance, and the instinct to keep moving. That contrast is important because it gives the story a moral shape without making it simplistic. One group is born into entitlement. The other is forced to adapt to survival. The movie does not present that as fair, because it is not. It presents it as the ugly reality of a world where some people are protected by systems and others are crushed by them. What gives the themes extra weight is that they are wrapped in entertainment. The film does not lecture. It turns its ideas into pace, blood, jokes, and chase scenes. That is the best way for a movie like this to work. The audience feels the class anger before they name it. They feel the ritual before they explain it. They feel the injustice because the story keeps showing how the rich can survive by turning violence into tradition. That is a very effective way to make themes stick. There is also a strong anti-ceremonial feeling underneath the whole concept. The movie repeatedly takes things that should signal stability, such as titles, seats, families, and formal behavior, and uses them to reveal corruption instead. That is one reason the sequel feels sharper than a standard slasher. It is not only asking who dies next. It is asking why the system insists that someone must die at all. That question is what gives the film thematic depth beyond the mechanics of horror. In the end, the themes of Ready or Not, Here I Come are about more than one woman surviving another night. They are about how power hides itself in tradition, how wealth disguises violence as order, and how survival can become an act of resistance. The high seat is the clearest image of all of that because it turns class ambition into a throne built on blood. That is why the sequel has the potential to hit hard. It knows the scariest thing in the movie is not the chase. It is the system that keeps inventing the chase in the first place. The performances in Ready or Not, Here I Come matter because the movie depends on people, not just plot. A story like this can have a clever premise and sharp visuals, but if the actors do not make the fear, anger, and dark humor feel alive, the whole thing collapses. That is especially true for Samara Uiving, whose return as Grace gives the sequel its emotional center. She has to carry trauma, wit, exhaustion, and stubbornness all at once, and that kind of role demands a performer who can make panic look intelligent. Weaving's Grace works because she does not play the character as invincible. She plays her as someone who has learned to survive by staying alert, joking when possible, and striking when necessary. That makes every reaction feel earned. In a film about a woman pulled back into a nightmare she already escaped, the performance has to carry memory in every line. Grace is not reacting for the first time, and the best thing Uiving can do is make that history visible without overplaying it. The character has already been broken once. What matters now is how she keeps going anyway. Kэtrин Newton's faith gives the film a different kind of energy. She is not there to mirror Grace exactly. She needs to feel like a separate person with separate damage. That is crucial because the sister relationship is one of the sequel's strongest dramatic engines. Newton has to communicate resistance, uncertainty, and buried loyalty in a way that makes the audience believe the sisters have years of emotional history behind them. If faith felt too convenient, the character would become a plot device. If she feels wounded and alive, she becomes the heart of the sequel's emotional tension. The dynamic between Grace and Faith likely creates some of the film's best scenes because it mixes trust and frustration in the same breath. A reunion under normal circumstances would already be difficult. A reunion while being hunted is much worse. That means the actresses need to sell both the personal distance and the immediate need for cooperation. This kind of tension is hard to fake. It depends on timing, silence, and tiny shifts in expression. The audience has to feel that these women know how to hurt each other and how to save each other, sometimes in the same scene. Sara Mishel Gellar's performance adds another layer of intrigue. Even before a scene begins, a performer with that kind of genre history changes the audience's expectations. That can be a gift in a movie like this, because suspense often comes from wondering what role a character will play in the chaos. Gellard can bring poise, menace, or irony, and any of those choices can work in a film built around social danger. The point is not just that she is recognizable. It is that her presence can alter the temperature of a room. Elijah Wood, David Cronenberg, Kevin Durant, Nestor Carbonell, Olivia Cheng, and Sean Hennessy all bring different textures to the ensemble. In a movie about elite families and power structures, those textures matter a lot. Some characters may need to feel cold and procedural. Others may need to feel frantic or strangely cheerful. Others may hide their motives behind calm politeness. A strong ensemble horror film uses that variety to keep the audience guessing. Each performer becomes part of the uncertainty. You are not only watching what the characters do, you are watching how they choose to present themselves under pressure. What makes the character tension interesting is that the film likely uses performance as misdirection. Someone who seems composed may be dangerous. Someone who seems unstable may be the most honest person in the room. That kind of shifting social energy keeps the movie alive. In a world where everyone is trapped inside a game, the performers have to communicate rank, fear, and hidden intent without stopping the story. That is a challenge, but it also creates fun for the audience. You start reading every glance as a clue. Samara Uiving's biggest task is to balance survival instinct with emotional fatigue. Grace cannot feel the same as she did in the first film. She has to carry the weight of what came before, but she also has to remain active and sharp. That balance is one of the hardest things for a returning lead to pull off. If the actor leans too much into trauma, the character can become passive. If she leans too much into toughness, the pain disappears. Uiving's strength is that she can make both things coexist. Grace can be wounded and dangerous at the same time. Kэtrin Newton's faith likely functions as the audience's emotional anchor into the sequel's larger world. Because faith is newer to the nightmare, her reactions can help externalize the scale of what Grace already knows. That gives Newton a different job from Uiving's. She has to show discovery, reluctance, and the gradual shift from resistance to survival mode. That progression is valuable because it gives the film an emotional arc that is separate from the physical chase. Faith is not just running, she is being changed. The ensemble also matters because horror tension often comes from social alignment. Who stands beside whom? Who is hiding behind manners? Who can be trusted for 2 minutes and then not at all? That kind of character tension works best when the actors lean into tiny behavioral details. A polite smile can feel threatening. A delayed answer can feel like betrayal. A firm stare can feel like a warning. The movie's cast has to support that kind of reading, and that is one reason the roster of experienced performers is so useful. There is also likely a lot of power in the way the film uses contrast between performers. Grace and Faith may carry emotional pain, while some of the supporting characters can project polished control. That contrast gives the story shape. The more composed the threat appears, the more alarming the violence becomes when it finally arrives. A good horror ensemble does not just include different characters. It includes different kinds of threat. Some are physical, some are psychological, some are social. The performers need to make all of that visible. What makes this particularly effective is that the sequel's premise gives almost every character a reason to conceal something. In a world built around competition for the high seat, no one can afford to be fully transparent. That means the actors are not just playing scenes, they are playing layers. A line might mean one thing to Grace and something else to the audience. That kind of tension is one of the pleasures of ensemble horror. It lets character work function as suspense. The relationship between Grace and Faith probably becomes the film's emotional pressure valve. When the action gets too intense, the audience can come back to the sisters' unresolved bond. When the emotional tension gets too heavy, the chase can snap everything back into motion. That interplay only works if the performances feel balanced. Uiving and Newton need to let the relationship breathe while still keeping the movie moving. That is a delicate job, and it is one reason the sequel's cast choice matters so much. One of the smartest things about this character setup is that it avoids making everyone too cleanly heroic. In a dark story like this, people look more interesting when they are messy. Grace can be protective and ruthless. Faith can be resistant and loyal. Supporting characters can be charming and dangerous. That mix gives the film room to surprise the audience. The performances are likely strongest when they refuse to simplify these people into good versus evil. Horror works better when everyone feels capable of fear and bad decisions. The tension also comes from the fact that the movie seems built around motion rather than speeches. That means performances have to communicate fast. A single beat of hesitation can tell the audience a lot. A scream can reveal more about a character than a long explanation. A shared look between sisters can carry a whole backstory. That kind of acting is especially effective in a film where the plot is moving quickly and the stakes are constantly shifting. At its best, the cast turns the sequel into a chain of reactions. Grace reacts to the system. Faith reacts to Grace. The supporting characters react to the possibility of losing power. The whole movie becomes a pressure test for the actors as much as for the characters. That is why performance matters so much in horror sequels. The audience does not just want bigger kills. They want to see whether the people in the film can hold together long enough to make those kills matter. By the end, the performance breakdown and character tension in Ready or Not, Here I Come seem to rest on one essential idea. The movie works if the audience believes these people are trapped in a nightmare that is both personal and structural. Grace has to feel like a survivor who still hurts. Faith has to feel like a sister who is not yet sure what survival demands. The supporting cast has to feel like part of a world where every smile might hide a knife. If those pieces land, the sequel has the emotional tension it needs to turn blood, power, and family conflict into something unforgettable. The release and reception story for Ready or Not, Here I Come is important, because it shows how the sequel was positioned not just as another horror film, but as an event built to attract both genre fans and mainstream viewers. The shifting release dates alone already tell part of that story. Reports moved from an earlier April date to March, and later listings placed the film in late March 2026, with some sources reflecting March 20 and others March 20 CVM. That kind of adjustment usually means a studio is trying to find the best lane for visibility and box office momentum. The timing makes sense for a film like this. A sharp, bloody horror comedy can work very well in spring if it has enough buzz and a recognizable hook. The sequel already had the advantage of a loyal audience from the first film, and the title itself is memorable enough to stand out in crowded listings. That matters because horror fans are often quick to show up when a sequel feels like it has the right creative team and the right attitude. The release window then becomes part of the strategy, not just a calendar detail. Festival exposure appears to have been another key part of the rollout. Early SXX view reactions are especially valuable for a film like this because they can frame the movie before the wider audience sees it. The first wave of reviews described the sequel as fast, savage, and entertaining, even when some critics felt it leaned too much on the original formula. That mix of praise and caution is actually very normal for a sequel that stays close to its roots. It tells the audience the movie is delivering the energy people wanted, while also signaling that it may not completely surprise them. That balance may have shaped how viewers approached the film. Fans of the original were likely looking for the same darkly comic violence, the same social satire, and another strong performance from Samara Uiving. Critics, meanwhile, were paying closer attention to whether the sequel expanded the mythology in a meaningful way. The reviews suggest that the film did expand the world and the violence, but opinions differed on whether that expansion felt fresh enough. That kind of split is common for sequels that succeed on style, but stay within the familiar contours of the franchise. The early review language also tells us something important about the film's audience reaction. Words like brutal, fun, inventive, and savvy point to a movie that knew how to satisfy genre expectations. At the same time, some critics noted that the sequel may not have matched the surprise factor of the first film. That is a real challenge. The first film's appeal came partly from its ability to shock viewers with a premise they had not quite seen before. A sequel cannot recreate first contact shock, so it has to win through execution. If the execution is strong enough, audiences usually accept the trade-off. Audience reaction for a horror sequel often depends on whether the film gives fans the right emotional payoffs. In this case, the return of Grace, the addition of Faith, and the broader network of elite families all offered enough novelty to keep the premise moving. The audience reaction seems likely to have been shaped by two things at once. First, there was satisfaction in revisiting a world people already liked. Second, there was curiosity about whether the sequel could scale up without losing its bite. That is the central question for almost any follow-up, and this one seems to have sparked that debate clearly. The rating and content profile also helped frame expectations. A film with this kind of gore, dark humor, and formal violence tends to attract a very specific crowd. That audience usually wants the movie to be sharp, mean, and fast, not broad or overly sentimental. The sequel appears to have delivered that. Early coverage emphasized blood, panic, and the continued wickedness of the premise. For the target audience, That is a good sign. If a horror sequel is going to succeed, it often has to reassure fans that it has not softened. The release strategy also seems to have relied heavily on the sequel's returning creative identity. By highlighting the same directors and the returning star, the marketing can sell confidence instead of novelty alone. That is smart because the first film's audience likely cared more about tone and character than about franchise branding. When a sequel can present itself as the same team, but bigger, it usually has a better chance of landing with the people who loved the original. The early discourse around this film suggests that is exactly how it was positioned. There is another reason the release and reception story matters. A horror comedy sequel can live or die by word of mouth. If audiences leave smiling, shocked, and eager to recommend it, the movie can perform well beyond its initial expectations. If they leave feeling that it merely repeated the first film, the buzz tends to flatten quickly. The review split here suggests a movie that probably generated lively conversation. That is often enough to make a sequel worthwhile from a studio perspective, even when critics disagree on how far it moved the franchise forward. The audience reaction likely also depended on how people felt about the sequel's larger world building. Some viewers love it when a horror story expands into a wider mythology. Others prefer the cleaner, more isolated terror of the first film. That tension probably shaped responses here too. Viewers who enjoyed the broader council, the rival families, and the high seat likely saw the sequel as a meaningful escalation. Those who preferred the original's tighter, more self-contained structure may have felt the movie was strongest when it stayed close to Grace and Faith. Both reactions make sense, and both speak to the challenge of making a sequel that satisfies different kinds of fans. The film's reception also appears to have benefited from the returning star power and the curiosity around the new cast. People tend to show up when a sequel adds names that make the world feel bigger. Sara Mishel Gellar, Elijah Wood, and David Cronenberg are exactly the sort of casting choices that generate conversation before release. Even people who do not know the plot can still sense that something strange and entertaining is coming. That is a useful kind of anticipation because it helps the sequel feel like an event rather than just another streaming title or studio holdover. Critics also seemed to engage with the movie as a tonal object, not just a plot machine. That is a sign the filmmakers preserved the franchise's identity well enough for people to talk about how the movie feels. Tone matters a lot in horror. If the sequel keeps the same nasty rhythm, the same dark wit, and the same balance of danger and absurdity, then even mixed reviews can still be a kind of success. People may disagree on how original it is, but they can still agree that it knows what it wants to be. The early reception suggests that the film likely landed as a strong genre entry, even for viewers who did not think it reinvented the formula. That is not a small achievement. Horror fans often do not need reinvention every time. They need confidence, personality, and a few scenes that stick in the mind. If a sequel delivers that, the audience reaction is usually positive enough to carry it through theatrical and home viewing life. The film's wider conversation seems to fit that pattern. In the end, the release strategy, reviews, and audience reaction all point to a sequel that was designed to hit with precision rather than surprise. It was released with a clear sense of timing, supported by festival buzz, and helped by the return of a beloved lead. Critics appreciated the energy and the expanded world, even when some missed the original shock. Audience reaction likely followed the same split, with fans celebrating the return of Grace's nightmare, while others debated whether the sequel justified its larger mythology. That kind of response is often the sign of a franchise that still has people paying attention, The bigger takeaway is simple. Ready or Not, Here I Come was released like a movie that knew its audience and trusted its own identity. That trust matters. It is what lets a sequel survive comparison and still feel worth watching. When a horror follow-up can make people argue about originality while still making them eager for the next scene, it has done its job. The business side of Ready or Not. Here I Come is interesting because the film sits at the intersection of franchise value, genre loyalty, and mid-budget horror economics. Even before you get into the numbers, the setup tells you a lot. This is not a giant tentpole trying to dominate the entire market. It is a sharp, recognizable sequel designed to turn a cult favorite into a bigger commercial proposition. That strategy often works well in horror, where a strong concept can outperform its size if the audience shows up. The most visible part of the business story is the box office performance itself. Available financial reporting now shows that the film reached a worldwide total of 42,792,168 according to the numbers. That is a meaningful figure for a horror sequel, especially one rooted in a stylized, R-rated premise. Horror often thrives on efficient economics, and a result like this suggests the sequel found a solid commercial lane. It may not be the kind of total that changes the industry, but it is enough to make the film a successful entry in its category. That success matters more when you consider the likely cost structure. Horror sequels of this type are usually built to be leaner than major action franchises, which means the financial target is different. A film does not have to become a runaway smash to succeed if the budget is controlled and the audience response is steady. The available reporting indicates that this sequel performed respectably against that model, which is exactly what a studio wants from a genre follow-up. It can keep the franchise alive without requiring superhero-level returns. The release timing probably helped the business outcome too. A March launch gives the movie a chance to catch viewers before the summer competition gets too crowded. That is especially useful for horror, where audience interest can be highly responsive to word of mouth and opening weekend energy. The film's positioning as a sequel to a well-liked original also helped create a built-in audience. People who enjoyed the first movie had a reason to return, and newcomers had enough of a hook to be curious. The cast strategy also likely supported the business side. Returning Samara Uiving gave the marketing a recognizable anchor, while additions like Sara Mishel Gellar, Elijah Wood, and David Cronenberg broadened the appeal. That kind of cast can help a genre sequel punch its weight. It gives the movie multiple selling points. Fans of the original come for Grейс. Fans of genre cinema come for the new names. That widens the commercial base without requiring the film to become less specific. Another business advantage comes from the film's tone. Horror comedies tend to do well when they are sharp enough to generate conversation and distinctive enough to be memorable. This sequel seems to have had both of those qualities, at least according to early reviews and audience discussion. When a movie inspires debate about whether it is as good as the original, that usually means people are engaged. Engagement is good for business because it keeps the film alive beyond the first weekend. It encourages repeat viewing, social sharing, and ongoing discussion. The box office total also suggests that the sequel found value not just in domestic interest, but in broader reach. A worldwide result in the low 40s implies the film traveled beyond a single market and found enough international attention to matter commercially. That is especially useful for a horror sequel because genre films often rely on stacked returns from multiple markets rather than one giant breakout. A recognizable title, a simple premise, and a strong lead can travel well, even when the movie itself is highly stylized and culturally specific. The business story is also tied to audience expectation management. A sequel like this has to promise fans that it will deliver blood, tension, and dark humor without looking too polished or too diluted. If the campaign nails that tone, the movie can attract its core audience efficiently. If the campaign oversells the scale and undersells the personality, the audience may hesitate. The available reception suggests the film mostly got the tone right, which is one reason the commercial result looks respectable. From a studio perspective, the real value of this outcome is franchise durability. A sequel that earns a healthy global total and stays part of the conversation helps justify continued investment in the property. It proves the original was not a one-off curiosity. It also shows there is room for the world to expand, whether through another sequel, related projects, or simply stronger value from streaming, digital, and physical releases. That long tail can matter almost as much as the theatrical run itself. The film's business performance also benefits from its compact identity. It is easier to market a movie when the hook is simple. A survivor returns, the game widens, and the stakes get worse. That kind of clarity helps trailers, posters, and social promotion work more effectively. Audiences do not need a complicated backstory to understand the appeal. They just need to know the sequel keeps the wild energy of the original and adds a bigger threat. Simplicity is often a business advantage when the concept is strong. There is another financial angle worth noting. Horror films often perform well when they can become conversation pieces without requiring four-quadrant appeal. This sequel fits that model. It is not trying to satisfy every viewer. It is trying to thrill the people who enjoy darkly comic violence, elite satire, and fast-moving survival stories. That focus can be commercially healthy because it lowers the risk of creative dilution. The movie knows exactly what kind of audience it is for, and the business numbers suggest that audience showed up. The available box office reporting also places the film in a comfortable middle zone. That is important because mid-budget horror does not need to dominate to be worthwhile. It needs to be profitable, durable, and recognizable enough to keep the brand valuable. A title like this can support that goal. It tells the studio the property still has life, and it tells exhibitors and distributors that the title can still generate interest. Those are the kind of signals that matter when a studio is deciding what to do next. The sequel's business outcome may also reflect the strength of the original film's reputation. A beloved first installment creates a trust advantage. Audiences are more willing to spend money on a sequel if they believe the creative team will honor the tone of the first movie. That trust is an economic asset. It lowers the barrier to entry for viewers who might otherwise skip a horror sequel. In other words, the original film's goodwill helped convert attention into ticket sales. What makes this result especially notable is that the film did not need to become an event blockbuster to count as a win. The business model is different here. It is about controlled costs, dependable genre interest, and strong enough cultural presence to keep the title alive after release. By that standard, the sequel's reported performance looks solid. It found a lane, held it, and turned a stylized horror premise into a real commercial asset. The later home release and streaming path also matter to the business story. Once a horror sequel has theatrical momentum, it can continue generating value through PVOD, Blu-ray, and other post-theatrical windows. That is especially useful for a film with a fandom-friendly premise, because genre audiences often support repeat viewing and physical ownership more than casual viewers do. The longer tail can make the project much more profitable than the raw box office number alone suggests. In the end, the box office and business outcome point to a sequel that did what good horror commerce is supposed to do. It delivered enough spectacle to attract attention, enough identity to sustain interest, and enough returning value to justify the franchise's continued life. It may not be a giant blockbuster, but it does not need to be. For a movie like this, a strong commercial result is not about becoming the biggest film of the year. It is about proving the nightmare still sells. The legacy of the first Ready or Not is the reason this sequel exists at all. The original film left behind a very specific kind of goodwill. The kind that does not come from spectacle alone, but from a sharp tone, a memorable lead, and a concept that felt both funny and cruel in the same breath. That legacy gave the sequel something rare. It gave it permission to return to a world fans already cared about, while also raising the expectation that the new film would add something meaningful, instead of just repeating the old game. What made the first movie so durable was its mix of horror and personality. It was a survival story, but it also worked as a satire of wealth, class ritual, and family dysfunction. That combination made it easy to remember and easy to recommend. People did not just talk about the kills. They talked about Grace, the ending, the absurdity of the rules, and the way the film turned privilege into a death trap. A sequel inherits all of that memory, which is both a gift and a burden. The new film builds on that legacy by treating the first story as a doorway rather than a completed circle. Grace did not simply survive and move on. She survived and discovered that the nightmare had a larger structure behind it. That is a smart way to extend the franchise because it reframes the original film as part of a bigger myth rather than an isolated event. Fans who loved the first film get continuity. New viewers get a broader entry point. The sequel uses the original's legacy to deepen the world instead of freezing it in place. The biggest legacy carryover is Grace herself. She became the face of the franchise because she was not a standard horror victim. She was funny, furious, exhausted, and weirdly resourceful in a way that made the audience root for her immediately. That kind of lead is valuable because she gives the series a human center even when the plot gets wild. A franchise can survive many changes if the audience still cares about the persons moving through the chaos. Grace gives the series that anchor. The first film's legacy also lives in the tone. It taught the audience that this world could be brutal without becoming joyless. That tonal identity is hard to preserve across sequels because later films often get self-conscious about what made the original work. Here, the sequel appears to understand that the dark joke is part of the fear. The audience expects satire, panic, and violence to sit together. That expectation is now part of the brand, and it is one of the strongest things the franchise has going for it. That brand identity creates franchise potential. Once a film series establishes a recognizable mix of humor, blood, and class commentary, it can expand in a lot of directions. It can add new families, new rituals, new survivors, or new corners of the same hidden world. The sequel suggests that there is enough mythology to support further stories without needing to abandon Grace's arc. That is a promising sign, because franchises usually struggle when they either run out of world or run out of emotional relevance. This one seems to have room for both. The rival families and the high seat show how the franchise could continue to grow if needed. Those ideas create a framework that is bigger than one family's curse. That means the next story, if there is one, could explore other branches of the same system without feeling forced. A franchise built on a hidden hierarchy has a natural expansion path. It can move outward while still staying thematically consistent. That is ideal for horror, because the audience gets both familiarity and discovery. The first film's legacy also lives in the audience's trust. People came back for the sequel because they believed the original creators understood the formula enough to revisit it well. That trust is one of the most valuable things a franchise can earn. If a viewer believes the tone will still be sharp, the violence will still matter, and the lead character will still feel alive, they are more likely to return for future entries. In that sense, the original film did more than succeed. It built confidence. Another part of the legacy is how the first film made horror feel socially pointed without becoming preachy. That balance is hard to maintain, and it is one reason the sequel matters. It has to prove the franchise can keep that edge, the class satire, the absurd family ritual, and the way wealth became a trap, all helped define the original movie's identity. The sequel inherits those ideas and expands them into a broader system, which strengthens the franchise's thematic consistency. That consistency is a major reason the property can keep going. The franchise potential also rests on character survival. As long as Grace remains interesting, there is room for more stories. A horror franchise does not need dozens of immortal characters to continue. It needs one or two people. The audience wants to follow through increasingly dangerous worlds. Grace fits that role extremely well because she already feels like someone who can adapt to almost anything. She is funny enough to stay engaging, strong enough to stay credible, and damaged enough to remain human. That combination is franchise gold. The sequel also hints that the universe can support different tonal flavors. The first film was tighter and more intimate. The sequel is broader and more mythic. That means future entries could lean more into thriller, more into satire, or more into action horror, depending on the story they want to tell. That flexibility is another sign of franchise health. A series that only works in one exact mode is fragile. A series that can adjust its scale while keeping its identity has much more staying power. There is also the legacy of audience conversation to consider. The first film became memorable because people wanted to discuss it, recommend it, and joke about its premise. The sequel seems to have continued that trend by generating talk about the expanded world, the cast, and the balance between familiarity and novelty. That kind of conversation is not just good publicity. It is evidence that the franchise still has a cultural pulse. A horror property that keeps people debating its tone and meaning has a real chance to endure. The business success of the sequel also strengthens franchise potential. A commercially viable follow-up tells the studio that there is still value in the property. That increases the odds that future stories will be considered, whether as sequels, spin-offs, or related projects. Horror franchises often grow this way. They start with one strong concept, then expand only if the audience keeps responding. The first film created the foundation. The sequel seems to have confirmed that the foundation is still strong enough to build on. What makes the legacy especially interesting is that the original film did not need a sequel to feel complete. That is usually a sign of a strong standalone movie. But the fact that a sequel could still feel worthwhile means the concept had hidden depth. The world was rich enough, the characters memorable enough, and the central satire sharp enough to support another story. That is the best kind of legacy. It is self-contained but expandable. Fans can love it as a single film, or they can follow it into a larger mythology. If the franchise continues, the biggest challenge will be preserving the original feeling of danger and wit. Legacy can become a trap if the series starts copying itself too closely. The sequel's job is to show that the world can widen without losing its nasty charm. If future films keep that balance, the franchise can keep evolving. If they forget it, the whole thing could flatten into routine. That is why the original's legacy is so important. It gives the series a standard to live up to. The first film also gave the franchise a very specific emotional promise. The audience knows this world is unfair, ridiculous, and dangerous, but also entertaining enough to watch with a grin. That promise is a big part of the legacies. A sequel that honors it can keep the audience invested even when the mythology changes. The more the series expands, the more important that promise becomes. It is the thread that ties the films together. In the end, the legacy of the first Ready or Not is not just that it was a hit. It is that it created a tone, a character, and a world that people wanted to revisit. The sequel proves that the franchise still has room to grow, especially if it keeps Grace at the center and treats the hidden world as something bigger than one family's madness. That leaves the property with real franchise potential. It can go further, but only if it remembers what made the original so sharp. The best legacy is not repetition. It is the ability to keep the nightmare alive without losing its soul. The lasting impact of Ready or Not. Here I Come comes from the way it turns a simple survival sequel into a larger story about power, family, and the strange violence hidden inside privilege. By the time you reach the end of the film, it is clear that the movie is not trying to be a bigger version of the first one just for the sake of scale. It wants the audience to feel that the nightmare has a structure, and that structure is bigger than one house, one marriage, or one night. That gives the film a strong identity and helps explain why it stayed in the conversation beyond the release. One of the most useful final facts about the film is that it keeps Samara Uiving at the center, which is exactly the right decision for the franchise. Grace is still the emotional anchor because she already means something to the audience before the sequel even begins. That kind of continuity is rare in horror, unless a character becomes iconic, and Grace has clearly crossed into that territory. Her return gives the sequel a built-in heartbeat, and it also gives the filmmakers a character whose reactions carry the history of the original film inside them. Kэtrin Nьютon's faith is another important piece of the film's impact because she changes the emotional shape of the story without replacing Grace. The sister relationship gives the sequel a second layer of pain and loyalty, which makes the action feel more personal. That kind of addition is more than a casting detail. It is a structural choice that changes how the audience experiences the danger. The movie becomes not just about one woman surviving again, but about two damaged sisters trying to move through a world that wants to use them as pieces in a larger game. The film's broader cast also adds to its afterlife as a pop culture object. Sara Mishel Gellar, Elijah Wood, and David Cronenberg are the sort of names that generate discussion before audiences even see the movie. That matters because horror fans love a cast that feels both surprising and specific. These actors bring different genre histories, and those histories become part of the viewing experience. Even when the characters are dangerous or ambiguous, the audience gets the extra pleasure of seeing familiar performers dropped into a bizarre and violent setting. A useful piece of trivia is that the sequel expands the original film's private family nightmare into a larger hidden hierarchy built around the high seat. That shift is one of the clearest signs that the filmmakers wanted more than a repeat of the first story. It also gives the movie a more mythic quality, which helps explain why fans started talking about the possibility of a larger franchise. Once a horror world starts hinting at councils, rival families, and succession structures, the audience begins imagining what else might be out there. That curiosity is a big part of the sequel's legacy. Another fact that matters is the film's release and reception cycle, which helped it build momentum. The shifting theatrical date, the early festival response, and the wave of review coverage made the sequel feel like an event rather than just another genre release. That kind of rollout is valuable for a horror film because it gives fans time to get excited while also letting critics frame the conversation. Even when some reviews argued that the sequel was less surprising than the original, the overall discussion kept the title visible and active. The film's box office result also helps define its lasting impact. A worldwide total of 42 792 168 is a solid commercial outcome for a stylized horror sequel. It may not be the sort of number that turns the movie into a universal blockbuster, but it is strong enough to prove that the property still has value. In franchise terms, that is what matters most. The sequel does not have to become the biggest title in the world. It only has to demonstrate that the audience still wants this universe and is willing to pay to revisit it. One of the more interesting trivia angles is the way the sequel continues the original film's tonal mix. The movie is brutal, but it is also funny in a very dark and specific way. That is not a small achievement. A lot of horror sequels lose the exact balance that made the first film stand out. This one appears to have kept that edge, which helps explain why people continued comparing the two films, instead of dismissing the follow-up as unnecessary. The sequel's tone is part of its legacy because it proves the franchise can still feel nasty, witty, and alive. The director's return is another important lasting element. Matt Bettinelli-Olpin and Tyler Gillett understood the tone of the first film well enough to preserve it in the sequel, and that continuity gives the franchise a sense of authorship. When a horror series keeps the same creative core, audiences are more likely to trust future installments. That trust is part of the movie's impact because it helps convert a one-time hit into a living brand. It also means the sequel feels like a true continuation rather than a corporate imitation. There is also a thematic legacy to consider. The film sharpens the class satire of the original by widening the hidden world behind the game. That makes the sequel feel more pointed because it suggests that privilege is not just bad in one family, it is systemic. The high seat becomes a symbol of inherited control, and that symbol sticks with the audience because it is so easy to understand. One throne, many families, one violent order. That is a simple but memorable idea, and simplicity often helps a horror concept travel farther. The sequel's lasting impact also comes from how it treats Grace. She is no longer just a final girl. She is a recurring survivor whose presence suggests that this world still has unfinished business. That gives the franchise a central figure with enough force to carry more than one story. In horror, that is a big deal. A memorable survivor can become the foundation for multiple chapters, especially when the world around her keeps expanding. Grace has that kind of potential, and the sequel makes that obvious. A small but meaningful detail is that the story keeps the emotional bond between Grace and Faith at the center of the larger chaos. That choice helps the film feel less mechanical and more human. It reminds the audience that beneath the rituals and the bloodshed, this is also a story about two sisters who were separated by life and then forced back together by violence. That emotional hook is one of the reasons the film lingers. People remember the action, but they also remember the relationship. Another piece of lasting impact comes from the audience's response to the sequel's bigger mythology. Some viewers clearly enjoyed the expansion, while others preferred the tighter simplicity of the original. That debate itself is part of the movie's afterlife. When fans argue about whether a sequel expanded too far or not far enough, it means the franchise still matters. It has enough identity to invite comparison and enough energy to make the comparison interesting. That is a healthy sign for any genre property. The film's visual identity also contributes to its memory. Elegant spaces, ceremonial authority, polished surfaces, and sudden bloodshed create images that stick because they are so contradictory. The movie keeps turning beauty into damage, and that contrast is one of the things audiences remember most from horror. A visual signature like that helps the film endure beyond opening weekend. Even people who only casually follow the franchise can remember the idea of a glamorous world built on something rotten. There is also a broader franchise lesson here. The sequel shows that a horror property can grow without abandoning its original voice. That matters because so many follow-ups either over-explain the world or flatten the personality that made people care. This film seems to have avoided both traps. It expanded the mythology, kept the jokes sharp, kept the violence mean, and kept Grace believable as a survivor. That combination is the kind of thing studios look for when deciding whether a franchise still has life. The final impact is partly commercial, partly cultural, and partly emotional. Commercially, the film proved that the property can still earn. Culturally, it kept the title in active discussion and brought in a new round of genre attention. Emotionally, it gave the audience another chance to watch Grace fight her way through a system that should have crushed her long ago. That blend is why the sequel matters more than a simple continuation. It is a reminder that horror franchises can still feel personal when they know exactly what story they are telling. One more trivia point worth noting is the way the sequel's concept naturally invites future stories. A hidden council, rival families, and a high seat are all open doors. The movie does not have to answer every question to be satisfying. In fact, leaving some of that world unexplained helps preserve the tension. That means the franchise can continue if there is enough audience interest, and the ending leaves that possibility visible without forcing it. That is a good sign for a series that wants to last. What makes the lasting impact of Ready or Not? Here I Come feel stronger than a standard sequel is that it understands how to turn repetition into escalation. Grace returns, but she is changed. The world returns, but it is larger. The violence returns, but it now feels tied to a broader order. That is why the film does not fade quickly. It leaves behind the sense that the original game was only the first layer of something much worse. That is a powerful place for a franchise to be. In the end, the film's final facts and trivia all point toward the same conclusion. This is a sequel that respected the original, expanded the mythology, delivered commercial value, and kept its central character compelling. Its lasting impact lies in the way it makes horror feel like both a personal struggle and a class war wrapped in black comedy. That is a rare mix, and it is exactly why the franchise still has room to grow.